It's new.
And we're live.
Good afternoon, committee. After our lunch break, we are here to hear a bill introduction of Bill 244, an act relating to state contracting standards for advertising. And I will invite Representative Shay Waters Evans, a sponsor of the bill, to start it off.
Thank you. Could you all introduce yourselves? Just kidding. Representative Rachelson is actually going to start, and she's on Zoom.
Oh, she is. I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Yes, we're co-sponsors. She's going to get going.
Behind your head, sir. Sorry. All right, Representative Barbara Rachelson, you may start us off.
Thank you. And thank you very much for allowing me to Zoom in. I will be back with you all in a day or so, but I am with my brand new grandchild. So
Awesome.
So thank you so much for inviting us here today to talk with you about H244. I am going to keep my remarks brief. We have an amazing lineup of witnesses, and I want to make sure that you have a chance to hear from them. I'm just going to briefly tell you why I introduced this bill with Representative Waters and why it's important and why I think it is an amazing win-win type of legislation. So ironically, back in the summer, I was reading 7 Days, and it had an article in there referencing the UVM Journalism Conference, which really caught my attention. While the data in the article, and I will forward to you my testimony and the links to the articles after, discuss the state of local news, both in Vermont and in our country. It was not surprising, but it was extremely alarming, knowing that as we lose journalists and local news outlets, more and more people will turn to Facebook and TikTok for their news is definitely of concern. I was in particular intrigued by Rebuilding Local News, which is a organization that you'll be hearing from. They were one of the organizations that had presented at this conference, which I cannot believe I did not have a chance to go to. I reached out to Rebuilding Local News, apologies for the dog barking, and was able to meet with staff there via Zoom, who walked me through many of the model policies and laws from their website that other states and municipalities had passed or introduced. And I decided for sure that I wanted to see what we could do in Vermont, and put in a few bill requests for these model bills. Many of these bills have a price tag attached to them. This one does not, which is very exciting. We spend a lot of money as a state advertising right now. And this bill, which I understand you'll get a walkthrough at some point and hear more about, would make a requirement that a certain percentage of that advertising be done with our local media outlets or national outlets that have a significant presence, or regional outlets that have a significant presence in Vermont. So it does not cost more money. It's spending our money wisely. There would be obviously tourism dollars spending, advertising those in the North Avenue News doesn't make sense. But for many of the advertisements that the state does, this has worked in other places, and I'm excited for you to get to hear about it. I had a chance to reach out to 7 Days and Richard Watts at UVM after I had met with the folks at Rebuilding Local News and learned that they had been getting organized to I'm just going to move here for a moment so you don't hear the dog as much. So they had gotten organized to try to work on these issues. And I learned that our colleague Shay was working on this. So it was exciting. And we were able to connect and co-sponsor this bill together. So with that, I want to turn my attention and put on mute so that you can hear the great folks that are about to testify. And I'm happy to answer questions. I will send you my written testimony, and we'll also give you the links to some really great articles. And thank you for considering it.
Thank you, Representative Rachelson. Rep. Waters Evans, would you like to?
Yeah, I'm ready now. I'm gonna be fairly short because I think it's important that you hear other people's voices. If some of you might not know, I was a local reporter and newspaper editor in the town where I lived, which was exciting and always an adventure for about a dozen years before I ran for office. And I really cannot overstate how important local news is for democracy as a whole, like on a municipal level, on a state level, national level. Like news reporting is just the most important thing, I think, for make sure that government is accountable, even if it's a select board or I used to tangle with our zoning board sometimes when I was a reporter. Just it's healthy, right? And unfortunately, the state of local news is not that healthy right now, especially in Vermont. I did a ton of research in the fall looking into ways that other states have dealt with this, looked at Rebuild Local News, looked at talked to senators and representatives from other states, see what kind of things work for them. There's some really big ideas that we are not doing right now that maybe someday we can do that are really, nationwide impactful kind of, let's sue Google or something, but that's really not where we can start right now. And I understand that, although sometimes I would like to. So what I think the good thing about this bill, as Representative Rachelson mentioned, it just takes the money that we're already spending as a state on advertising and directing it toward local news. The goal being to make sure that local news outlets are getting this advertising money to sustain them. I briefly started my own newspaper and I was and worked at a nonprofit as the editor before that. And a lot of time is spent fundraising, and it's sketchy. You don't always know what you're going to get, when you're going to get it. And as reporters shouldn't also be trying to figure out how to pay for their reporting. So this just makes sense, as Representative Rachelson said. Like, really simply, we're taking money that we already have, that we've already allocated for advertising. We're just directing it toward Vermonters, toward Vermont-owned businesses, toward local businesses. And I'm sure you all read your paper. In Charlotte, we are lucky enough to have 2 print papers, and people, they read those. And it's hard to get money to sustain them, but I think it's vitally important. If you have any questions, feel free to ask.
I have
Yeah.
one quick question.
Yeah.
Can you just give us an example of the advertising that you're talking about?
Sure. Is there someone else who wanted to speak to that or is going to speak to that?
And if so, I'll hold my question.
Yeah.
I think April, if I could just say, is prepared
Yeah.
to address that in her
Okay,
remarks.
great. Then we'll wait.
Yeah. I just wanted to tell you why I was so excited about it. Why I think it's so important.
Thank you. Rep. Hooper?
Are we talking about paper or are we talking about local digital also?
Any and all. Broadcast, print,
See all the above.
internet, skywriting, however the news is prepared.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Next on the agenda, Paul, would you like to introduce yourself to the committee? And would you like to hear introductions from us?
I would love to, but I think I know most of you, so our time is short, so I'll just dive right into it. That works for you all. Thank you all so much for having me here today. I really appreciate it. And especially thank you to Representative Waters Evans and Representative Rachelson for supporting this bill, introducing this bill. For the record, my name is Paul Heinz. I've been working in and around news organizations as a reporter and editor in Vermont for most of the last 2 decades, starting with the Brattleboro Reformer, more recently at 7 Days, and then BT Digger. I'm now a freelance reporter and an advisor to the University of Vermont's Center for Community News. That's the organization that put on the conference last summer that Representative Rachelson discussed. And it's been a great forum for discussing ideas out there to strengthen the local news industry. I'm speaking today on behalf of a broad coalition of Vermont news organizations that have been searching for ways to support what you all know is an imperiled industry. The coalition includes statewide news outlets such as WCAX, Vermont Public, and BT Digger. It includes small community weeklies such as the Barton Chronicle and the White River Valley Herald. It includes legacy daily newspapers like the Rutland Herald, the Bennington Banner, locally owned news outlets, newspaper chains, and nonprofits like the Bridge in Montpelier, the Commons in Brattleboro, and the Waterbury Roundabout. It includes broadcasters from around the state, including small radio stations that serve each of your communities. What unites us all is a belief in local media, and a fear that if we don't take action soon, these organizations may not be able to share essential information with Vermonters and help safeguard our democracy. In the last 25 years alone, according to a recent UVM study, Vermont's lost 75% of its jobs in the newspaper industry. And not surprisingly, rural communities have been hit hardest. Our coalition studied various ways the state could help bolster Vermont journalism, You'll hear in a moment from Lori Henson from Rebuild Local News, which has worked with other jurisdictions on various solutions, including tax credits and subsidies. We know those would not fly in Vermont's current budget environment, so we are instead bringing you a modest Vermont-scale solution that would not cost an additional dime. That's why this proposal has drawn tripartisan support, including from a pair of statewide office holders, Lieutenant Governor John Rogers and Secretary of State Sarah Copeland-Hansens. With H244, we are asking only that the state of Vermont practice what it preaches and buy local. Our research suggests that the state may be sending millions of advertising dollars out of state, in many cases to social media and search companies such as Google, Facebook, and the platform formerly known as Twitter. Why would Vermont spend its limited resources on these Silicon Valley corporations when it could invest that money instead in news outlets in Milton, Manchester, and Randolph? Precisely how many state advertising dollars are leaving Vermont is not entirely clear, as my colleague April Barton will explain in a minute. That lack of transparency is part of the problem this bill seeks to address. By requiring the Department of Buildings General Services to provide an annual summary of our advertising spending, we can better ascertain whether that money is being spent wisely. We don't believe this proposal will radically reshape the state advertising process, and we want to work with you to address reasonable concerns. That's why from the get-go, we've suggested exempting tourism-related advertising, because we know at times the state is specifically seeking to reach those who are not served by our organizations. But when the state is trying to reach Vermonters, we think we're best positioned to help. Vermonters listen to our stations on the road, they watch our newscasts at night, they read our papers when they arrive in the mail or at the local store. Some, including probably some people in this room, even hit the refresh button on our websites multiple times a day. We are the ones prepared to deliver life-saving information during floods. We're the ones fact-checking information, covering local select board meetings, and letting folks know what's up for discussion on town meeting day. We're the ones trying to let your constituents know what you're debating in this very committee room. On its own, H244 will not solve the crisis facing local news, but we believe that every dollar counts, and we don't have any time to waste. And for that reason, we respectfully ask that your committee consider this bill as quickly as it possibly can. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Hines? Rep. Cooper?
Sorry to be a pain,
Yeah.
but you mentioned, I'm looking for a definition of what local is, because you mentioned specifically CAX, which used to be quote unquote a local union station and now has gone somewhere else. News coverage has changed. Where is that line kind of being drawn? What is it? What is it?
It's a really great question, and it's one that we've talked about as a group, because defining media has always been one of the most challenging things. I was in here some years ago discussing a media shield bill that became media shield law in Vermont. And that was one issue that came up time and time again. How do you define who a reporter is, who a journalist is? And it can be a little bit perilous because you don't want, as the government, to be in the business of overly defining who counts and who doesn't count. So for the purposes of this bill, we've taken a big tent approach. And we have said, essentially, if you're a media organization in Vermont, and the bill spells out some specific definitions, we want you to be included in this. And so that means that organizations like the Burlington Free Press or the Rutland Herald or the Times Argus that are owned by out-of-state organizations, but employ journalists in Vermont and serve Vermont readers, we said they should be included. For broadcasters, we said, sort of an easy and elegant solution was if you hold an FCC license and you're in Vermont, then you should be included. So that includes radio stations, it includes TV stations, it would include both locally owned and ones owned by companies outside the state. But the point is that they're in Vermont, they're serving Vermont, serving Vermonters. So it's medium agnostic, it's also economic model agnostic. We're not just looking to help nonprofits, not just looking to help for-profits. It's all of the above, because I think we all believe that you really need a broad and diverse media ecosystem to provide the information and the diversity of views that Vermonters really desire.
If you look at the bill on the bottom of page 3, it defines local news organization. I won't read it to you, but it's there. With all the specifics of what you just said.
Approximately how much dollars are we talking that the state spends in advertising?
So that, believe it or not, is not really known. And that is, I think, a really important part of this bill as well. To the best of our knowledge, advertising is, every department, every agency does it a little bit differently. It's theoretically, if I understand this correctly, through BGS, but each entity of state government is spending its money differently. So April, who's going to speak in a moment, spent a lot of time trying to get to the bottom of that question. We have some preliminary estimates. April will go into more detail here, but we believe the state spent at least $7.5 million on advertising in the 2024 fiscal year. But that's probably an undercount because it's sort of accounted for in different ways. And so one, I think, really important part of this bill is the last section, which requires BGS to submit a report each year to you all, summarizing advertising services purchased by the state, et cetera, so that we know, so we have a better sense of where that money is going and how it's being spent. And I think that could help inform future discussions as well.
Thank you. Additional questions from the committee? If not, we have a slightly different order on our agenda, but you're referring to April, so we'll call April Barton next, please.
Great.
Thank you.
Just gonna go back to my.
Hello, committee. Thanks for having me. I'm April Barton. I'm representing UVM's Center for Research on Vermont. And like Paul said, I spent a lot of time trying to look at data of how the state of Vermont is spending its advertising dollars and where those funds are going. And so I did pull, as Paul also mentioned, I pulled from the state of Vermont's portal for public payment information any record that had advertising or marketing in the name for fiscal year 2024. And what I found, total, what's that? Oh, I thought I heard somebody say something, sorry.
No.
Thank you.
Total expenditures I saw were about 7.5 million. And of that, Vermont vendors and businesses operating in Vermont, they made up about 4.5 million of that. And then non-Vermont vendors made up about 2.9 million. So if we're looking at percentages, Vermont vendors made up about 61%, and non-Vermont vendors made up about 39% of the money that was spent on advertising in 2024. I will say tourism and marketing is included in these numbers. And as we discussed before, tourism and marketing certainly is spending a lot of their money outside of the state. So that's something to be considered. And these are just rough estimates. There are definitely holes in the data, and there are definitely opportunities to increase transparency in the way these are logged. For instance, advertising agencies, we can see how the state of Vermont is spending money with advertising agencies, but then and see those total amounts, but we're not seeing what the agencies are then going and spending that money on, and whether they're spending it on Google or Facebook or other outside of Vermont entities. So we can't track that in the way it's recorded right now. And secondly, there are about 10% of the money of the records actually were listing the state of Vermont itself as the vendor. And those occurrences were sometimes when an agency was using a purchasing card, or if money was being given back to the Human Resources Department because they were placing job ads on behalf of that state agency. But because that doesn't say an actual vendor, it's hard to even know where that money went. I tried going to the individual state departments and agencies and requesting information, and I got limited success getting back information for those. So there are those holes. And like I said, we could increase some transparency. The other thing that I noticed is that the state of Vermont tends to spend a lot of money outside of Vermont for creative houses. Those are the ones who may be creating ads, video ads, print ads, advertising campaigns, also creative houses. And then I just lost my place. So creative houses, but also advertising agencies that are outside of the state as well. And so we do have a lot of those companies here in Vermont the state could be spending money with, and even some of these local news organizations that are represented in this group are capable of creating this type of advertising content or making national and local buys at their organization. And so those are some of the things that I noticed. I'll address real quick. You had a question about the types of advertising that Vermont is doing, and job ads. I mentioned lottery has quite a few ads. You may have seen also the unclaimed property ads with Mike Pichek and Tom Mesner. That's another form of advertising that the state, they're creating that content, but then they're also advertising it on the local media stations. Sports betting and gambling, you'll see ads for those. Also, the health department has run a bunch of ads when there was COVID, also when extreme temperatures, smoking cessation. So you'll see some of these initiatives that are being advertised across media, but also the tourism and marketing department, of course, is spending a lot of money on Google ads, trying to get people to Vermont, and other publications and media outlets that are outside of Vermont to try to advertise the state and bring them in. So I'm still here if anybody else has questions about the data, but that's my statement for now. Thank you.
I do have a question. You just mentioned tourism, so that's going to be exempt from this particular law, correct? Is that what I heard?
Yes.
I'm not sure if it's going to be exempt.
Yep.
Is it? Okay.
Yes.
Rep. Waters Evans is nodding her head. So how would this differ in the future if this law was passed? Because right now, if I'm searching on Google or looking at a website, I'll see like smoking cessation ads, for instance, or sports betting ads. Would those be eliminated on those particular types of sites that are kind of nationwide internet sites?
I mean, it depends on who the state of Vermont wants to advertise with. You could do those same ads locally, or you can use a national firm to place those ads in different places and non-streaming devices and things of that nature. But you also do have local advertising agencies who are capable of placing in both as well.
So if the state of Vermont wanted to advertise on those types of platforms, this is what I'm getting from this, then they could go to a Vermont-based advertising agency and ask them to do the work to put those ads on those types of platforms.
Correct.
Because I don't see those ads going away because they're really effective and they reach a lot of people because a lot of people use their devices. So it's just ensuring that somewhere along the line a Vermont vendor is getting compensated for placing those ads. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
Also, they're not gonna be able to spend all of their money, so they still have 20% of their budget to spend however they wish. And if they would like to spend that on social media sites or, games or whatever that is, then they can do that.
Thank you. Any additional questions for our witness from the committee? Rep. Hooper?
Well, expanding on the conversation that you just had, that sort of is the thing that I wondered, particularly when you get down to the Facebooks and the other media like that, you get to sort of pick your audience. So money that you spend could stay here, even if you're on some mega platform in terms of the advertising, but the creation and everything else goes someplace else.
And I think the local news outlets are hoping that they'll get part of that as well, that some of these ads can still be on the local TV station, radio station, in the papers as an ad, in addition to using Facebook and other platforms.
I think we're ready,
Okay.
just in the interest of time.
Thank you very much. So, our next witness, we were a little bit out of order. Lori Henson, please.
Hello, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you all today. You have a fantastic coalition in Vermont, and so it's been a real pleasure to work with everyone. And I'm especially pleased to offer my support for our support at Rebuild Local News for the bill that Representatives Rachelson and Waters Evans have introduced. H244 is an important bill for Vermont, and I'll try to talk a bit about how it compares nationally to what's happening. I manage the advertising portfolio at Rebuild Local News. We're a national nonpartisan nonprofit organization. We represent more than 3,000 newsrooms across the country. And together with our member organizations, we advance public policies that counter the collapse of local news. And we especially focus on revitalizing community journalism and strengthening democracy. And so I hope that the committee will consider H244 and advance it. The crisis that you are facing in Vermont and the local news organizations and communities in your state, they are well known, they're ongoing, and they are a threat to democracy. They're not unique. This is a national problem, and it's particularly dire for small and medium-sized communities, some of which are now news deserts, without a source of local news coverage altogether. Vermont has not been spared from the crisis. The state lost a daily newspaper and 3 weekly newspapers over the past year. That's according to Northwestern University, which measures news deserts. Between 2013 and 2023, Vermont lost more than half of its journalists. And you heard Paul talk about 75% at newspapers. So it is a crisis in our judgment. And so what we also have learned is that when communities lack local journalism, there are researchers that have studied the effects of more than 2,000 newspapers closing since 2004, and we are still losing newspapers at a rate of 2.5 closures on average per week. What we know is when a news organization closes, voting rates decline, municipal borrowing costs go up, government waste increases, citizens tend to feel less connected to their communities. Political polarization goes up when everything in the news is nationalized. Even news organizations that have weathered this crisis are doing so with fewer journalists. Newspapers nationally have lost over half of newsroom employees since 2004. So there are too few journalists that are stretched too thin right now, and that's true in Vermont as well. Stretching newsrooms to the breaking point is especially common at hedge fund-owned newspapers, which control now about 50% of daily newspaper circulation. So keeping news news local and supporting and sustaining those organizations is really critical. Unfortunately, the challenges that are facing communities across Vermont are not the exception. What is exceptional, though, is H244 is taking a really unique approach to addressing these problems. And so what is good about this bill is that it recognizes local news as an essential public good. And so it's an innovative and I think a very hopeful policy approach that supports news organizations through a government advertising set aside. As you've heard from others, this is really just about being intentional with the state's spend, not increasing the state's spend. And it allows news organizations ultimately to deepen and expand their coverage of essential civic and community life across Vermont, while also, importantly for us, protecting those organizations' editorial independence. And so the government is not determining, it's not picking winners and losers. It is applying a common standard across the board for local news. So Vermont would lead the nation actually in adopting this approach. There are other states that have introduced and heard bills of this kind, and they are in various states in the or various phases of the legislative process. But what makes H244 really, I think, innovative is that it requires government agencies to be intentional about how they're distributing ad placements more equitably among Vermont community news outlets. And so that broader distribution is especially helpful to small and mid-sized news organizations. It requires government ad agencies and advertising agencies to be more transparent, as you've heard, about where the advertising dollars are spent. And it also requires the engagement of a third party to ensure that the policy is being followed fairly and consistently by the government, by advertising agencies and news organizations. And you have a really important and valuable asset with University of Vermont. And so I think that's a really important aspect of the bill, that it produces a firewall between government and advertisers and news organizations. So when we talk about the bill protecting the independence of news organizations, it means that when government advertises for things like job recruitment, public health information, government services, they do it the same way they do it today. They work with an ad rep. And so this is a known process. This is not, as Paul was saying, this is not about shaking up the entire system. What's also important is what the bill does not do. H244 does not impact how agencies advertise their messages. It doesn't affect the content of what the government ads say. And those decisions are still retained entirely within the state agencies in collaboration with their marketing and ad professionals. The bill does not restrict where government is allowed to advertise. Agencies can still choose the media that best connects them with the audiences they want to reach, whether that's, through different mediums, broadcast versus print versus digital, or social media even. There are a number of ways that local media can insert itself into the process of social media advertising so that it is getting some of that dollar and also vetting those ads for quality and the trust of the audiences that they have online. So again, there are important firewalls in this bill that protect the independence of news agencies. And so this 80% spend still leaves room for government agencies to place ad spending where they think it is the best value. So news organizations are already adapting for the last 2 decades. They're being innovative and adaptive to the crisis that faces them. And this is just a way for government to provide a cost-effective leg up to them for the important work that they're doing. Also, there is precedent for this historically in the United States. So we've seen all the way back to 1792, the Postal Act, which gave favorable distribution rates to newspapers and to the press. We've seen other government assistance in the form of public broadcasting and other kinds of considerations because of the special role local news plays. So we've also seen this particular policy with the ad set aside result in really promising revenue for small community and ethnic news organizations in New York City that adopted this policy in 2020. The last report we got was that about $17 million had been generated for ethnic and community media in New York City. It is its own sort of universe there, but I think Vermont would see similar kinds of positive effects for local news revenue with this kind of policy. So with that, I'm happy to answer any other questions, but I hope that the committee will support this bill.
Thank you. Any questions for our witness? Okay, well, thank you very much. We'll go on to Kathy Resmer.
Hi there. Hi, everybody. I'm Kathy Resmer. Can you get me? I'm the deputy publisher of 7 Days and one of our employee owners. I'm talking with you from our Burlington office. Thank you so much for the opportunity to appear before your committee today. Hopefully you're familiar with 7 Days. We deliver 35,000 copies of our free weekly newspaper to more than 1,000 locations in northern and central Vermont every Wednesday. You should have some papers in Montpelier by now. And all of our content is also online. You can read it on your phones as well. In addition to journalism, 7 Days produces events, including the annual Vermont Tech Jam, Career Expo, homebuyer seminars. We do a youth talent show. We organize the Good Citizen Challenge, which is a nonpartisan civics project for K-8 students. The company got its start in 1995, 30 years ago this year. Founders Pamela Polston and Paula Routley were two journalists who set out to create the arts and culture weekly that they wanted to read. Initially, they covered local music, theater, books, film, visual art, and food. Back then, there were a lot of other places to find local news, including daily newspapers like the Burlington Free Press, which at that time employed dozens of reporters and editors. That was still true way back when I started writing for 7 Days in 2001. But the state's media landscape has changed in the last couple of decades, as some of the other speakers have mentioned. Around 2008, when the Free Press started cutting its news coverage, 7 Days stepped up to help fill the gap. Over the last 17 years, we have built a seasoned team of news reporters and editors alongside our team of culture writers. And today, 7 Days employs 20 full-time reporters and editors, along with a team of freelance writers, critics, and consulting editors. In 2024, 7 Days news reporters alone wrote more than 700 stories. That includes late-breaking election coverage and in-depth features, like, for example, Derek Brower's cover story on Decker Towers in Burlington last February. He and photojournalist James Buck documented the ways that Decker's elderly and disabled residents were forced to protect themselves as the public housing project became a de facto homeless shelter. And Derek's perceptive eyewitness reporting helped 7 Days. It helped us win the Newspaper of the Year from the New England Newspaper and Press Association, which is great. But more importantly, it jolted city officials into action. Derek has now written 5 follow-ups since, and the last one was just about how conditions at Decker Tower have improved. Last March, 7 Days was the only Vermont media outlet to send a reporter to New York City to see an overdose prevention site in action while the legislature debated whether to allow them here. Back in November, you might have seen a deep dive that we published on Vermont's skyrocketing healthcare costs. Just so you know, these thoroughly reported and readable stories, they're our specialty. They open hearts and minds. And they sometimes influence public policy. In 2019, 7 Days tackled the opioid crisis with Hooked. You might remember, it was a year-long series we did. In 2023, we focused on the causes and effects of the state's housing shortage in a series called Locked Out. That same year, we published Joe Sexton's shocking 16,000-word expose on the abuse of young people and Woodside Juvenile Rehabilitation Facility. On the culture side, we maintain a comprehensive music, visual art, and events calendar. We publish previews of shows that you don't want to miss. We do hundreds of spotlights and profiles of local businesses, especially through our 7 Daisies Readers Picks contest, which you might have seen those Daisies plaques at businesses all around the state. We pull off ambitious culture projects too. We sent 11 different reporters across the state to document last year's eclipse. We sent Marianne Lichtai to Broadway to profile Vermonter Shaner Taub. Shaner Taub, who created the musical Suffs, which won multiple Tony Awards. We aim to inspire Vermonters to encourage them to get off the couch and get involved. And this kind of enterprise journalism takes time and money. These big stories require weeks of research, and each one goes through editors, proofreaders, and sometimes lawyer. Journalists are cheaper than lawyers, but they're not free. Editorial salaries alone cost us $1.2 million last year. It's our biggest single expense. Add another $500,000 plus for printing, more than $250,000 for health insurance. That doesn't begin to cover rent, equipment, libel insurance, mileage, or the rest of our staff. Most of that money goes right back into our communities, making it possible for our employees to live here, buy houses, volunteer for local organizations. You know, for years, 7 Days paid for everything with revenue from local advertising. As many of the Vermont media organizations can attest, that business model is still working, but not like it used to. Our local retailers have been undermined by Amazon. Many restaurants haven't recovered from the pandemic. Other businesses are still reeling from devastated floods. Some are spooked by all the changes and the uncertainty in Washington, D.C. We also have a dizzying number of competitors. That includes social media giants like the ones we've talked about here today. I just want to make the point that none of those platforms creates content or verifies it before publishing. None of them organizes or sponsors local events or trains young people to work here the way we do. None of them put millions of dollars back into circulation in the Vermont economy. So Vermonters understand why it makes sense to buy food from local farms or products from local businesses, and we need that to extend to local advertising channels as well. Sorry, I had to go over a little bit, but thanks again for your time.
Thank you. No worries. Any questions for Kathy? All right, not seeing any questions from the committee, we'll move on to the next witness, Angelo.
Yes, hi.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. Nicely done, Kathy. I think, first of all, for the record, my name is Angelo Lynn. I'm the editor and publisher of the Addison County Independent, and I've been here for the last 41 years. It's been a while. Those years have included serving as president of the Vermont Press Association a while back, as well as being president of the New England Press Association, of which I'm still on the board there. Those roles have put me in constant contact over the last 4 decades with many of the newspapers in Vermont and also so I have a fair sense of what we're looking at, the struggles that are out there that we're all going through. And I can tell you a couple of things today. And that is first, that the news industry continues to face strong uphill winds. And that includes most of Vermont's community newspapers. That's dailies and weeklies, for-profits, nonprofits, print, digital only. That's all of us. It's not easy out there. And we're out doing what we can to get every dollar that we can through the door so we can fund our operations and do the service that we do for our communities. The second point that I'd like to make is that local media continues to be one of the best ways to reach the local audience that's interested in news about the state or advertising about the state. And it's because that's what, they read us first and they trust us, which is the other thing. That's one of the basic points that Kathy was just making is we do all this work and we're read well by our consumers because they trust us. And they trust that we're going to do the best thing for our communities and the best thing for the state. I don't think that's probably true with Facebook and X and Google, at least in terms of how they view Vermont. I'd also like to say that what Lori from Rebuild Local News was saying can't be emphasized enough. We have lost 75% of our journalism jobs in the state for the last 25 years. And we've seen a handful of weeklies go out of business and a daily go out of business. My own brother's daily went from 6 days a week down to twice a week. So these are, these are struggles. They're real. And while we're not looking to make a lot of money, or even when we parse this all out, how much money is going to get here, I think the principle is to shop local. Support what we can, build up the communities as we can, help us do our job, and be intentional when the agencies make that decision of where to advertise. And that's just the basic ask. Not a huge commitment here. It's just be intentional, think local first if you can, and make good on that promise. I would just note that a lot of our papers are doing, fairly well. I'm going to contradict myself a little bit. We're still here. And the reason we're still here is because we're supported by our communities. And that goes for, we have about 30 something weeklies and 7 dailies left in the state, something like that. We represent really small towns, a nonprofit in Brandon, all the way up to 7 days with its bigger outfit. But in Middlebury at the Addison Independent, we have a staff of 20. We almost have 10 people devoted to news here at the Independent, and it costs money, real money. So when we're looking to get even $10,000 or $20,000 that might come our way, that's no small deal for us. And so these would be important things to consider. So in short, the message from our point is to buy local. It's not just the right thing to do, but it's also one of the most effective ways to reach the local marketplace, to reach the Vermonters that you're trying to do. By the way, I would assume most of you or many of you are employers. When you're advertising for a position, they need to do a couple of things. They need to be probably locally based, because if they're not, if they're coming from out of state, let's try to find housing for them. So, reaching Timbuktu doesn't do you a lot of good. And then if they don't know the state well enough to understand our winters, they better love winters here, because that's who we are and that's what we embrace. And what we find when we advertise for our own local jobs is local people that understand the state. Those are the ones that you actually end up hiring, and they stay here and they become part of your team for a longer period of time. So I would say a couple of things for the employment ads. Local advertising is your most effective advertising. The other points have been well made. Appreciate the comments from the other folks that have testified, and what Paul said earlier, that what unites us all is a belief in local media and its effectiveness. And with passage of H244, the hope is that little extra will keep us all serving our communities for the next generation. So to that end, we appreciate your consideration and support of the bill. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Any quick questions? Because we are running a little bit behind right now. Okay, we'll call our next witness, Wendy Mays.
Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Wendy Mays. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Association of Broadcasters. And in the interest of time, I'm going to try to keep this at 60 seconds. I am not going to read from the prepared testimony that I did submit. So if you're interested in it, please do read it. But a lot of it was exactly the same thing that the coalition members just told you. And I agree wholeheartedly with it. I'd like to use my 45 remaining seconds to tell you a story about WTSA AM and FM radio in Brattleboro, Vermont. This radio station is in a place in Brattleboro where there's only the Brattleboro Reformer and the Commons, which is the nonprofit paper. There is no broadcast television station down there. They actually get a lot of their news from Boston because that's just the way that it is. So when people are looking for local news, they go to the Brattleboro Reformer, the Commons, or WTSA. And it's been around for 70 years. They used to have 2 full-time people dedicated to news gathering. And now they're down to one part-timer. And it's simply because the cost of running a radio station has been increasing over time, whereas the revenue from advertising has been steadily decreasing. And this is a trend that we're seeing all over the place. And I'm going to tell you just really quickly, because this is the perfect example of what's wrong. So I'm just going to say it. In October, I wrote a letter to the Department of Liquor and Lottery when I found out that a company that they had won the contract for Vermont Liquor and Lottery, Fuse Ideas, they went from severely cutting back to now a full stop of buying radio advertising in Vermont's unrated markets, which meant that Vermont lottery ads were no longer heard on the radio in nearly 50% of the state. So I was letting Department of Liquor and Lottery know this and pointing out to them that, you know, whereas the shiny new toy of digital may look good on paper, it loses its luster when you see how it affects real people. And had asked them if they would, you know, reconsider, which they did, thank goodness, and talked to Fuse Ideas. But that's the perfect example of what's happening. If they contract with an advertising agency outside of the state, they don't know what's happening here, and they're making decisions all about shiny new toy and not realizing that this money could be so much better served keeping it local with the newspapers, the radio, the television stations that are a fabric. They're completely weaved into the fabric of the communities that they serve. I know I went a little over 60 seconds, but
we appreciate your brevity. Thank you. Any questions for Wendy?
Thank you.
That's good. Thank you very much. Really informative. Thank you all for being here. Unfortunately, we have to switch gears and hear another new Bill intro. So thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Kate Nugent. Who's Kate Nugent?
Thank you.
And switching gears, we're going to H233. Representative Nugent, would you like to take the chair?
Yes, chair.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah, ACC.
Hello, everyone again. So this bill is a revision of a bill that this committee passed out last year unanimously and could be very helpful to a number of sectors in the state, municipalities, sheriffs, and nonprofits. Increasingly, the state's nonprofits and municipalities, most of which are very small, just like our businesses, have found some of the ways that the grant processes with the state are carried out to slow down their work and kind of get in the way of the actual work that they are asked to do. And so this bill is aimed at making those processes more efficient and beneficial to the service delivery. And also, importantly, there's a study group that would look at grant processing across the state. So all the agencies in the state that provide grants, each one has a different process, has different paperwork associated with it, different timelines, and that, especially for municipalities, actually can be really challenging to have to redo all your paperwork for each type of grant. One of the other things that this bill would do would require the state to come up with a process that nonprofits and other entities applying for grants could request a higher indirect rate. An indirect rate applies to things that are not specifically attributable to one project, but they're absolutely not, even though it says, you know, it's a de minimis rate, which means inconsequential, it's not inconsequential for the work because it goes towards things like rent, or the cost of internet service, insurance, all these things that you have to have in place to do the work. And so depending on the type of nonprofit and the type of work that they do, if the state only covers a certain amount of the actual cost, it means that the entity has to raise the extra funds from somewhere else to cover that, or they have to not take the project on. So this would not require the state to allow a higher indirect rate. It would just require there to be a process by which the nonprofit could work with the state to agree upon a higher rate in case those costs would be helpful. And then it actually would reduce the amount of time that that entity has to spend on doing the paperwork and this other stuff to apply to the service itself. So that's kind of the gist of the whole grant or the whole bill. Last year, we talked with the Sheriff's Association and Vermont League of Cities and Towns and Common Good Vermont. And we heard from a lot of groups that were finding similar issues and for whom this could be really beneficial. So it has a lot of support among those three groups. And I'm excited about this bill. So we have Charlie, you can call them, but we have
Great.
some other folks here.
Does anybody have any questions for Kate before we let her out of the hot seat?
Love that phrase came back into use.
Okay, thank you. So next witness, please, Charlie Baker.
It's okay, we'll
Joint testimony?
Yeah.
Great. So, Charlie and Peter.
I got it. Thank
He
you.
likes Jack.
I gotta go eat. See, I heard it's hotter. See
Oh, you got it.
Way in here.
Go ahead, introduce yourselves, please.
Thank you. Yeah, good afternoon. For the record, Charlie Baker, I'm the Executive Director of the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission.
And I'm Peter Gregory, Executive Director of Two Rivers Ottaquechee Regional Commission, Windsor and Orange Counties.
And if it's okay, I'll start off first and then Peter will fill in and correct me as needed. But one thing, first I want to apologize for kind of missing this bill moving last cycle, or we would have chimed in. The regional planning commissions and towns in Vermont have raised similar issues. And so and we support kind of the broad purpose of kind of getting more efficient and effective and consistent with how we're doing things in the state administratively. You know, this bill's focused on Bulletin 5, which deals with grants and sub-grants to entities like ours. The RPCs do not have any general revenue. And so we literally, aside from some dues from our towns, which make up about 5% or so of our budgets, the rest of our budgets actually come from grants. So I was gonna say we love Bulletin 5, but we're very familiar with Bulletin 5. And do support efforts to streamline the administrative processes and make it more consistent. One of those is about promptness. We saw that there's like some timeframes in here for agency responses. We definitely support that. Agencies have been getting better, but it would be good to have timeframes actually specified in Bulletin 5. Indirect rates, we all use indirect rates, and they are definitely not 10%. And to cover our costs. And so there does need to be consistent state policy. We have grant agreements with multiple agencies. And, you know, I'm kind of thinking back to a few years ago, we had a new grant relationship with the health department. And it was like we went into a whole new world and a whole new world of requirements that we weren't dealing with the other agencies we deal with. And so much so that like I had to go to the secretary level to get them to sign off on our indirect rates, which are approved by VTrans actually. So we have state approved indirect rates, but the Agency of Human Services wasn't aware of that and wasn't ready initially to support that. Finally, the secretary said, yeah, no, that's fine. Somebody reviewed it. We'll honor that indirect rate. So getting consistent recognition across state agencies. If one state agency approves an indirect rate, which would be great to have a process for that to happen. But then they also need to be recognized across the agencies. And so definitely support that. And then finally, the kind of bidding and award process, we would be interested in going a little further. We're finding times where agencies know at the outset that they want to enter into a relationship with the regional planning commissions to communicate or work with our towns. And so that we're the easiest way to do that, but because it wasn't in statute typically, or it wasn't in the law that got passed or in the budget bill, they're like, oh, but we got to go out to bid. And it's kind of crazy because they're spending a bunch of time on paperwork and we have to respond to the proposals and spend a bunch of time on paperwork. They have to review it, even though they knew at the outset that they were going to hire us, but they didn't feel like they had the authority under Bulletin 5 to just go ahead and do that. So we would be interested in maybe some additional language in this draft, in this bill, if you're open to it. Happy to provide that afterwards. Peter, I don't know if you want to add any other examples or more detail.
Well, I would, thank you. I'd just like to thank you, Representative Logan, for reintroducing this and the committee's work last year in getting a bill like this through the House. We would like to do whatever we can to be helpful in making sure it applies to all the entities that could benefit by this. And the regional planning commissions have a lot at stake here. And you might think, well, why are you just bringing this to the legislature and not having tried fixing it with the agency of administration? And I'm glad you asked that. We have been trying for literally decades to bring these things to the attention. It's as if we have different state governments at play here. It's probably maddening. It delays our work. It costs money. Our towns are hurt by it. We sometimes lose federal dollars. So we have attempted to work with them, but then a flood will happen and then the agency is overwhelmed with flood recovery. So there are a lot of things that can be solved by a thorough review through a study, which is great. We have some suggestions on broadening that out to maybe include the league and maybe some RPCs. But I think it's high time that the legislature weigh in and provide some specific direction on how to handle these situations. So it's not left up to interpretation or a new administration or a new staff person. So I think we are eager to help you in any way we can. And we just wanted to be here initially to kind of say, we have some issues here. We'd love your help and we'd like to offer our help.
Thank you. Any questions for the RPCs? Okay, very good. Representative Nugent, have someone else you would like us to listen to since we have a little bit of time left and then we're going to have to pivot to budget discussion again.
Thank you. Yeah, Emma Paradise, if you would like to. Give a brief.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Good to see you all again. For the record, my name is Emma Paradise. I'm the manager of policy and strategic initiatives at Common Good Vermont. I was not planning to speak today, but really appreciate the opportunity just to reiterate some of the experiences that we've been hearing from organizations across the state. We actually convened a working group of organizations representing everyone from childcare to youth services to environmental organizations who receive state grants and contracts. And so a lot of what's in this bill is informed directly by those impacted by it. And so just some of those issues to reiterate that we've been hearing, reimbursement is one issue that comes up, probably the most frequent concern we hear. This has been more and more frequent over time that funding is expected to be paid out of pocket by the organization and then reimbursed by the state. Oftentimes organizations, particularly those that are smaller and might not have as much reserve funding, have to take out bridge loans. I had one person submit a report that they had to take out $20,000 to cover costs. Another, their executive director chose not to be paid that week because they had an 8-week delay on the payments that they were receiving. So these are really impacting the organizations and take additional time away from their work that's really at the core of what they're there to do. And so, and sort of compacted on top of the reimbursement challenge is the delay of payments that we've heard about, as well as the delay of contracts. Oftentimes organizations are performing work without being under a contract. We had one organization report that they wound up spending $17,000 because they didn't have a contract in place, were expected to carry forward the work. And then when they went to submit for payment, they encountered so many challenges that they just wound up backing out of the contract completely. So it's really having a financial impact as well as administrative. And I think I think the process related sort of inconsistencies across agencies and departments can be challenging. The indirect rate, I think others have spoke to. We did appreciate that the Agency of Administration updated Bulletin 5 to 15% this summer, which was really helpful, which puts it on par with the federal indirect rate. And I want to echo that we really want to work with the state, with you all, to find solutions that work. We know that the grant administrators, they're managing a lot and that there's a lot on their plate. So I think that this working group is really an opportunity for us to come together, identify where those pinch points are, where their improvements can be. And we've seen this happen in other states. Common Good, as part of the National Council of Nonprofits and other state associations like us, have been working on different solutions to these challenges. And so there are ways to move forward, and really optimistic about that.
Thank you. Any questions for Ellen? Okay, thank you very much. Thanks to all our witnesses.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
And we're going to probably take like a 5-minute break.